Alright, hey guys, Will Tipton here, and this is the introductory video for my new video series on solving poker with IPython and Fictitious Play. And if you don't know what either of those things are right now, that's fine, because that's what this whole series is about. So my second book on Heads Up New Limit came out quite recently, and I've been fairly successful in poker myself, but my day job, what I do every day is I'm a software engineer at a major Silicon Valley software company. So that's sort of the background I'm going to be drawing on for this video series. So if you read either of my books or you know much about them, then you know that I think it's very useful and very important to study model poker games, to look at strategies for playing those games, and to look at equilibrium strategies in particular. Unfortunately, the games that we can solve by hand, that is, using pencil and paper, are quite simple. We can only solve quite simple model poker games. And so the strategies that we get, they might capture some of the complexity of real play, but they also neglect a lot of things. So it's dangerous to take those simple models and the strategies for playing them too seriously. Let me give an example. Something that a lot of people say about equilibrium play is that you should always call in order that your opponent can't, automatically profit with his bluffs, or if he's bluffing with air. That is a property of certain model poker games, and there's some truth to it. However, it's often the case, as I talk about early on in my second book, it's often the case that that rule leads to bad strategies in real play. So for that reason, we like to solve larger poker games, but we have to use computers to do that. And so that's something I did in both of my books. I presented the solutions to large poker games that were too large to solve by hand, but which we could do using computers. Unfortunately, until now, there hasn't been any publicly available software for you to do that sort of thing by yourself. Right? And I think there's a lot of value to being able to do those things on your own, to look at games that you're interested in, to look at spots that you're interested in, because you'll get more out of that than you ever will from reading textual descriptions of games in a book. Okay, so that's what this video series is about. It's about learning how to do that, for yourself, from the bare bones. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. So there's this thing called IPython, and you can check it out at ipython.org. It's an interactive programming environment. It uses Python, which is a language, and it does some extra work to make it interactive. So the great thing about Python is that it's very easy to learn and use. There are some programming languages that the syntax, the things that you have to write in order to make the computer do something, are fairly non-intuitive. Python is not like that. You can pretty much just write what you mean if you're familiar with mathematical notation and some other simple things that we'll go over in a lot of detail. And it makes it easy to use, and it makes it quick to make the computer do useful things. So I think IPython is a great tool to learn how to use in and of itself. So what we'll do in this video series, as it says here, we'll develop code to work with ranges, strategies, decision trees, and so on. So all of the big tools that we developed in the book, equity distributions, for example, all of those big tools that we use to work with games, we'll find some representation in the code in our video series here. Okay, so my plan is to just walk you through the whole process, from start to finish of doing this development project. So we'll start with an empty IPython project, and I'll essentially just write the program. I'll explain to you everything that I'm doing, every line that I write, and I'll also take some time to make asides about some of the bigger concepts that motivate what I'm doing, both in the computer and with respect to some poker topics. This is not a software development video series. This is not about programming. I'm not going to start out with an introduction to the language or anything like that. We're going to jump right into it and get started, and then I'll just explain things that as we need them, for our particular problem. So hopefully that'll make it engaging and exciting. But this is not like a complete introduction to programming, and I don't mean it to be that. Okay. So the code that we're going to write is code to essentially work with all of those things, but then we're going to do something with them. And what we want to do with them is to find maximally exploitative strategies for playing games, and then equilibrium strategies. So the big idea of how to do this was actually covered very early in my books, in Expert No Limit Hold'em, just chapters 1 and 2. So that's the first volume. We went through in that second chapter how to find the maximally exploitative strategy for any opponent strategy, and that's the main thing we'll be doing here today, or doing in this video series. We also mentioned very briefly in that chapter, I guess I just mentioned it as sort of an aside, that we could use the capability to find maximally exploitative strategies to also find equilibrium strategies using fictitious play, which is the big idea there is essentially that you just start out with a guess at two-player strategies and then alternate back and forth, solving for each player's maximally exploitative strategy in sequence, and in that process, with a little extra detail that we'll cover, with a little extra detail, it will eventually converge to the equilibrium. So what you'll need to follow along in this video series is a computer. Of course, that shouldn't be a problem, I don't think. I'll focus on Windows computers. However, I don't think it should be a problem for anyone to follow along on either a Mac or a Linux computer, if that's your preference. And then the background, sort of again, no programming background is necessary. There will be programming in this video series, so an interest in that sort of thing, it will certainly be helpful. But no background is assumed or necessary. I guess the the corollary to that is that if you have a programming background, some of the video series might seem rather slow to you. I might be telling you some things you already know, but I think there's actually going to be a lot of useful poker information as we get deeper into the video series also. The reason for that is that in chapter 2 I sort of went over the big idea of how to solve for a maximally exploitative strategy, but I might have fudged some of the details, and when you were reading you probably even fudged more of the details and that you skimmed over some of the equations or whatnot. However, to tell a computer how to actually find the maximally exploitative strategy for a given game tree, you have to get every detail right. And so in particular, there's a few spots where card removal effects come into play that you may not may not have expected. For example, your opponent's range. If you're playing a particular hand and you want to calculate the EV of going to the next street, your opponent's range has an effect on how likely each of the new cards are to come off. Right? So that's a detail that you probably don't take into account in most of your decision-making processes. But to get things right in our code, we'll have to think about all of those things. Right? And sometimes they make a difference. Okay, so that's what we'll do here. We'll go through just the process to write the code to solve all of these things, and then we'll do some examples. Alright, so I want to say a little bit about why I think that we should, or that you should write your own software instead of using someone else's. Well, I guess you don't really have a choice, at least at the time of this recording, because I don't think any other software that does this is available. But even if you did, why do I think it's better to show you how to write your own software than just to give you my own? Because that's something I certainly could have done. Okay, so there's two reasons for that mostly. First of all, this sort of thing is sort of on the cutting edge of research, and in order to do it correctly, it's really important to understand exactly what you're doing. I think the whole point here is to understand things as deeply as possible, and for that it's really helpful to know exactly what your computer is doing, and to be able to sort of do it yourself by hand, or to sort of know how you could do it yourself by hand if you had to. The reason why it's important to do that is it allows you to really understand what the computer is doing, essentially. Okay, and the second reason that I think it's great for you to be able to write your own software instead of just using software that I've written is that you'll be able to answer questions that I haven't even thought of yet. You'll be able to extend the software once you know how it works. You'll be able to extend the software to solve sorts of problems that I haven't anticipated, that I haven't already written software to figure out how to solve. So if you really want to do some cutting edge research, it's great to be able to do this yourself instead of just using software that I've already written. Great. Okay. Actually, I show here on the right some pictures, some ranges. This is incidentally the solution to the min-ray shove game at some stack size or other. I just put them here for decoration, but these are figures that were made by the software we'll write. So in particular, one thing we'll want to be able to do is to visualize a range, and we'll be able to make pictures like this. So this is completely unedited screenshot actually of the software that we'll write and how it will represent ranges, visually for us to see. Actually, the same thing goes for that picture I stuck in on this other slide. This decision tree at the bottom, it models sort of a simple two-street game. So up here we're at the turn in the big blind. I don't know if you can't read it, it's not important, but basically this is just the polar versus bluff catcher decision tree over two streets with two possible rivers. So in particular on the turn there's a flush draw possible, and then on the river, one river card means the flush card comes in, on one it doesn't, and we'll set different frequencies for those two occurrences, and then we can solve this sort of two-street game. Okay. This again is an image that is generated completely and it's unedited. It's generated completely by the code that we'll write. So we'll be able to set up decision trees and then visualize them to check that we set them up correctly and whatnot. Alright, now I want to say a bit about the contents of the video series, exactly what we'll be doing. The total is about 12 hours, so it is a pretty good amount of content, and I think I think it's necessary to fully explain what I'm doing, because again, I'm not assuming any sort of background as far as software development goes. Okay, so I guess let's just walk through it. We'll start out saying a bit about how to set up IPython on your computer. And it turns out that in addition to the basic IPython program that we'll install, we'll just download and install it. There's a few extra things that we'll need to set up in order to help us out with calculating equities and that sort of thing. So the next thing that we'll do is to load it up and take a look at some of the basics of how it works, and then we'll get right into the poker stuff. So we'll start out with hand versus hand equities. And so hand versus hand equities are the basis of our hand versus range equities, which is what we'll actually be using a lot of. It turns out that our program will need to do a lot of equity calculations, so it's important that they happen fast. So in most of this video series, I'll focus on just doing, the bare bones. I'll take the bare bones approach. I'll do what we need to do to get a useful software package that can solve games. I won't take a ton of extra time to do things like make it too pretty or worry about efficient memory usage or things like that you might want to do later, if you're into that sort of thing. However, one thing that we do need to do is we need to take a little bit of time aside to do hand versus hand equities fast, just because we have to do them so often, and it turns out not to be all that difficult to make them way faster than the naive approach. Okay, so we'll do that. The next thing is to work with ranges. So ranges will be, the video about ranges will be our introduction to classes and objects. So those are important computer science concepts. If you're not familiar with them, don't worry about it at all. Talk about it a lot. Very useful ideas. And once we have ranges, we'll do hand versus range equity calculations as well. Once we have ranges and hand versus range equity calculations, it turns out to be very easy to draw some equity distributions. So although we won't actually use equity distributions very much, just because they're so easy to draw, given the infrastructure we built up by the sixth video, we'll go ahead and do that. And so on the right here, I show an image that was created by our software. And then in video 7, we'll solve the shove fold game. Okay, so the point of this sort of intermediate step, this step 7, sort of marks the halfway point of the video series approximately, and it's sort of the point where we've developed enough, I guess, computer modules or whatever. We've developed enough infrastructure so that we can start to do some useful things, and in particular, we'll solve a real game. However, it'll also point us in the direction of what we need to do next. The thing about the shove fold game is that both players just have essentially one range describes the strategy of each player, right? The small blind just has a shoving range, and the big blind just has a calling range. Of course, the small blind also has a folding range, and the big blind has a folding range too. But you can get it immediately from the other two ranges. Okay, all right. So we don't really need to worry about dealing with the player's whole strategy because their strategy is just one range. Additionally, we don't really need to deal with the decision tree itself because the decision tree itself is so simple also. Okay, so we'll solve the shove fold game, but we'll see a couple places that we need to develop more infrastructure in order to work with general games. And the two things that we need to do there are we need to work with game trees and strategies for playing those game trees. And so that's what we'll set out to do next. We'll develop some code to work with decision points and trees. We'll visualize those trees just like in the image I showed previously over here. We'll visualize those trees. We'll do some work on strategies for playing those trees. And then we'll get into sort of the climax of the video series, calculating maximally max EV play, and then maximally exploited strategies and fictitious play. The real tough part, I think the hardest part of the video is actually the part about maximally exploited strategies. I would say it's really the only hard part of the video. All the stuff leading up to there, I think is pretty straightforward, even if you have no experience with programming. We go through it slowly and whatnot, but it's really this part that actually has to do with poker, that has to do with things like card removal effects, and just various details that are actually poker related, that make this last part challenging. And then finally, once we have maximally exploitative play, finding equilibria with fictitious play, or FP, is actually very easy. It's very short. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some examples and some conclusions. And that'll be about 12 hours total. Hopefully at the end, in addition to understanding all of this stuff very well, you will have a software tool that you can use to go out and solve spots that you're interested in, spots from your own play. You'll be able to one, set up a decision tree describing the play. Two, set up some starting ranges for that spot, and then 3, solve the game. Look at the strategies for playing that game, and then look at the EVs of every hand in every point in the strategy. Right, so that sort of analysis is very useful, as we saw in the books. Okay, so let me wrap this video up with, I guess, more or less what I just said. This is sort of meant to be a give a man to fish sort of project. Instead of telling you exactly what to do, I'll give you more tools to do it yourself. But with this sort of software, what I do is I find spots that I'm interested in that maybe I don't know how to play very well and I want to learn about better. I set up a decision tree for studying that spot, for how all the ways play could go for the rest of the hand. I set starting ranges, and then I solve it. I calculate equilibrium strategies for the play of that subgame, and then I look at the strategies. I look at the ranges and the EVs of every hand and every spot, and I see how I should play certain hands and whatnot. However, what you can use it for is whatever you want. Again, I think certainly any of the sorts of computational solutions that I presented, say in Volume 1, should be no problem at all with this software. Some of the ones that I did in Volume 2 they required a lot of computer resources, I guess, a lot of memory and a lot of processor time. So there's no theoretical reason really why you couldn't use this software to do it if you had a big enough computer, but you probably don't. Okay. But that said, you can certainly use it to study lots of interesting situations. In the bottom here, I stuck a screenshot of the first lines of our code, so you can take a look at what it might look like. All right, I'm gonna wrap up this video. Please let me know if you have any questions, or check out the free excerpts of the video that we make available also. All right, take care, guys. Good look at the tables.